All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Adrian Untermyer. I am chair of the New York Preservation Archive Project. Was hosting this event this evening on lost landmarks and the history of the hardship application in New York City. I think we all know about the catalyst for this interesting and informative event tonight about history, not advocacy, but the history of the hardship application process under our landmarks law. And that catalyst is the West Park Presbyterian Church battle. We're very fortunate to have some people with us here this evening who are involved in that battle to talk not only about West Park, but also about the intellectual underpinnings behind the hardship application, how we got here, a historical overview of some high points of that application, and then really keeping an eye towards the future. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge our generous sponsor, the Richard Hampton Ginrette Foundation, who preserves the history of that man and also does so much to foster historic preservation throughout our community. And also our co-sponsor here tonight, the Historic Districts Council, headed up by Frampton Tolbert, who you'll be hearing from a little bit later. Our all-star panel this evening, as you know, consists of Michael Hiller, preservation lawyer of some repute, Emily Kahn, our executive director of NIPAP, and of course, Laurie Beckelman. But first, as a very special treat, we would like to kick things off with some opening remarks from truly the dean of New York's preservation movement these days and the founder of the New York Preservation Archive Project, Mr. Anthony C. Wood. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Tony's new book, Servant of Beauty, is about Albert Sprague Bard, the grandfather of the landmarks law, and that book is out now. So Tony, welcome, and please kick us off here this evening.
Well, thank you, and welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us as winter returns to New York out there. So you'll find some warmth, I think, during this conversation. So the New York Preservation Archive Project was started because of our belief that preservation's own history could inform, instruct, and inspire the preservation movement today and in the future. And we see preservation's history as the intellectual capital of the preservation movement. Tonight's panel illustrates why it's important to know the history of preservation and highlights the significance of NIPAP's work to document, preserve, and celebrate that history. So though the Archive Project is not itself an advocacy organization, it helps document preservation advocacy and thus provides historical context for and insight into current preservation efforts, hence tonight's panel. So tonight's panel, the subject, the hardship provision of landmarks law, is one where you really need to understand context and history, because though it's a critically important aspect of law, it's not very well known, I think, to most preservationists. And I think the reason for that is the hardship provision is kind of preservation's brigadoon. After years or even decades of being lost in the midst, it episodically pops up, commands our attention, and then again disappears for years back into the fog. Fortunately, hardship applications are rare occasions, which is why it's particularly important to know the history of such applications when they do appear. In a real sense, the hardship provision of the landmarks law is actually the safety valve for the law, helping to protect it from legal challenges that designation might constitute a taking without compensation. One also needs to understand that the landmarks law was created not to make sure New York City never lost another landmark, but rather to make sure no landmark was unnecessarily lost. So meaning that instead of the past, when New Yorkers would wake up to discover a cherished building was about to be lost and have no recourse to try and save it, instead there would be an established, orderly process to determine if a landmark was indeed truly threatened, and if so, if it could be saved. And that's what the hardship provision provides. Tonight, we'll hear what it takes for the LPC to establish that a landmark has a hardship. In a case where the commission does make a preliminary determination of hardship, there's then a designated period in which ways to alleviate that hardship can be explored, including the Landmarks Commission finding a willing buyer for the building or recommending that the city acquire the building. It's interesting just to know that process actually unfolded in two early hardship cases. The first one with the Drome Mansion, after a preliminary determination of hardship was made, LPC tried to find a buyer unsuccessfully. It then recommended that the city condemn the property. The city decided not to. But in a subsequent hardship proceeding in Brooklyn, LPC was successful in finding a buyer, and the landmark was saved. Tonight, you'll hear more of the history of the hardship applications over time. Personally, the hardship battle I remember the most is that of St. Bart's, which is now over 40 years ago. Mostly, I have memories of organizing and participating in a candlelight vigil in front of the church during a torrential rainstorm. More substantively, I remember the combined efforts of the Municipal Art Society and the New York Landmarks Conservancy to prepare for the hearing, assembling a panel of experts to address every argument brought forth by the applicant, leaving no argument unaddressed, down to the smallest detail. For example, the church argued that its terracotta tiles were brittle. So the preservation groups got experts to testify that indeed terracotta is inherently brittle. But some takeaway lessons from that St. Bart's struggle, not just organizing, not just to not organize a candlelight vigil in the rain, but seriously looking at that experience, it showed the value of putting a coalition of preservation groups together to take on the application, to assemble a top-notch legal team, to gather a cadre of technical, financial, and preservation experts to address all the issues, to build public support, to work with elected officials, to organize testimony, things we'll be hearing about tonight. The hardship provision of law is now a timely subject because of the current issue in front of the Commission. It's our hope that this panel will provide useful context and information to help us all better understand this aspect of the law and today's battle over it. So now back to Adrian and the panel.
Tony, thank you so much for those remarks, and thank you for mentioning St. Bart's. We're going to get into that battle a little bit later this evening. You'll see behind me is the interior of St. Bart's, but of course the fight, I believe, was about the community house and other portions of that structure. So nuances matter here, and we're really looking forward to getting into the weeds with everybody. And speaking of everybody, time to tell you a little bit about our panel. Our first up, we have Mr. Michael Hiller. He is really synonymous with preservation law in the city of New York right now. His cases have made it all the way up to the New York State Court of Appeals, but of course he's down in the weeds with us in every sort of preservation battle, including West Park. Welcome, Michael. Great to have you here with us tonight.
Hey, no, Andrew.
And Emily Kahn as well. She is our executive director at the New York Preservation Archive Project. She's a graduate of Columbia University's preservation program. She's a teacher, a frequent lecturer. She's really invigorated NIPAP. We're so glad to have Emily here this evening. Welcome, Emily.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. And in a little bit, we're going to be joined by Laurie Beckelman, who really needs no introduction, but her leadership of the Landmarks Commission and the fact that she's really been in the weeds on many other preservation battles as well makes her a wonderful addition to our panel, as is Frampton Tolbert, who's going to be closing us out this evening, the fearless leader of the Historic Districts Council. Frampton, welcome as well.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, Tony was on our Wrecking Ball podcast recently, right? That's the podcast about historic preservation, the law, and the great city and state of New York. And we really had to start with definitions, right? Definitions are the starting ground. We don't really know what we're talking about unless we know what we're talking about. And Michael, please just give us a crash course. What are those elements of the so-called hardship application under the Landmarks Law? What is a hardship application?
Sure. First of all, just to clarify, it was earlier said that hardship applications are rare. Just to give everyone some perspective, there are over 38,000 protected properties under the Landmarks Law. There have been 13 granted hardship applications. That gives you a sense of just how extraordinarily unusual these applications are and to grant them. With respect to the requirements, I'm going to focus predominantly on nonprofits since that seems to be the subject of the day, because the standard for nonprofits is different from for-profits. For nonprofit, there are 4 requirements. The first one is that the owner is required to have entered into a contract of sale with respect to the subject property that is contingent upon the grant of a hardship application. So the contract has to have a provision that says we're only closing if there is a granted hardship. Hi, Laurie. The second requirement is that the subject property must be incapable of generating a reasonable return, which the Commission for Landmark for Nonprofits is construed as 6%. So the subject must be incapable of generating a 6% return or more, assuming reasonably prudent and efficient management. Now, we can get into what the formula is. The Landmarks Law actually provides that formula. I'm not going to do that now, but I'm going to talk about an important corollary to that principle because it became very relevant at the last public meeting with respect to the West Park Presbyterian Church. The corollary is this. For purposes of the Landmarks Law, the net annual return yielded by a landmark property during the test year is presumed to be the earning capacity of that property in the absence of substantial grounds to the contrary, which basically means However that property did during what's called the test year, that is presumptively going to be what that property is capable of. It's not how the owner actually did, because the owner may not have done his work or her work with reasonably prudent and efficient management. It's what it actually did during that year, or what it's capable of doing that year, assuming reasonably prudent and efficient management. The third requirement is that the subject property has ceased to be adequate, suitable, and appropriate for the purposes to which it was devoted by the owner at the time of the application and at the time of the acquisition of the property. The owner's aspirations about the future, I want to do this, I want to do that, that doesn't matter. It matters how it was actually being used at the time of the hardship application and how it was used by the owner at the time of its acquisition. And I will tell you, and I don't get too deeply into this, I have a disagreement with the general counsel for the commission. The general counsel of the commission believes that another factor to consider for purposes of suitability is whether or not repair costs would be so extraordinary that the property couldn't be used. I disagree with Mr. Silberman on that. Because I don't see that either in the statute or in the decisions of the commission.
And where has that happened before, Michael? In all the years that I've been involved with Landmarks and as former chairman, that has never, ever, ever been considered in any of the applications. So why all of a sudden is this coming up now?
I'm only mentioning it because it did come up at the last public meeting and in the submissions by the parties. And lastly, the fourth requirement is that once the application for hardship is granted, the demolition must be, quote, immediate. And the replacement building must be erected, quote, with reasonable promptness. There's sort of I wouldn't call it a fifth requirement, but one sort of corollary to the entire test is that any alleged hardship cannot be self-created. In other words, an applicant can't, for example, empty all of its entire building of all of its tenants and then say, you know what, I'm not getting enough rent. That's not permissible. Or I'm not going to repair my building. Oh my gosh, I can't afford to fix my building. I'm not maintaining my building. Oh my gosh, all of a sudden the roof came in. You can't do that either. So those are basically the four requirements. And as I should mention it also that the applicant is required to prove all of them. This is not something where opposition or the public has any burden of proof. So this extraordinarily rigorous standard, and that's a term of art that Valerie Campbell, who represents a lot of applicants before the commission, use, this extraordinarily rigorous standard has to be met by the applicant. And again, it's very rarely been granted, only 13 times out of 38,000 properties.
Michael, thank you so much for that introduction. Really, the Supreme Court has taught us in recent years, you have to start with the text. And before we get to the history, we really need to understand. Laurie Beckelman has joined us, obviously former leader of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, but a lioness in her own right. Laurie, fill in what the text doesn't tell us. The hardship is a little bit of a safety valve, I guess. Is it not? Wasn't that the intent originally? And how did you view it?
Well, thank you. My apologies for not being as technically advanced as I actually thought I was. Anyway, I'm on. I had the good fortune for the 4 years that I chaired the commission that I didn't have any hardship applications. However, as a former deputy of the Municipal Art Society and then as the executive director of the New York Landmarks Conservancy, I was involved with a number of hardship applications, but I also had the great good fortune, because I am not of counsel. I've never studied the law formally. At the same time, I've had the privilege of working with some of the most remarkable minds in the legal profession. And sorry, Michael, that I never had the opportunity to work with you, but I have a feeling that's going to come up and I will be working with you sometime. I look forward to that. But what I must say that as a layperson and chairing the commission, and my passion for the city, is that the Landmarks Preservation Commission has a remarkable professional staff that has their pedigree is absolutely outstanding. While when you have 11 commissioners, there are a number of lay people, there are certain requirements that have to be made. That doesn't mean that any of them know anything about hardship and legal things. And that's where the commission, I think, is required and has the responsibility to get the best minds as their consultants. I don't know, and maybe Michael, you can, and others can comment on what's happening right now before them. But if they don't have the best minds working on this, we're really in trouble. because that is what the commission, the chairman of the commission, the leadership, and the counsel to the commission should be demanding. And even the commissioner, I mean, even the council, that's not his expertise. So you need outside counsel to be the expertise so that the city and the people of the city are getting the best advice. And I'm not sure that's happening. I'd like to know more about that. But that's what I know that I always demanded. And I had I was very, very lucky that we had many different firms that helped us in going to a number of different cases that actually went to the Supreme Court. And it was, I think, many of the outside counsel that really did help the city win.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Emily, while we're lingering on this topic of definitions, right? You spent quite a bit of time in the archives looking at various hardship applications from over the years. And one thing that you shared with me privately is that this really takes on an outside role both in the archives that NIPAP has uncovered and others, right?
Yeah, so as my fellow panelists have discussed, hardship applications are relatively rare, but they are certainly not rare within the archival record of preservation. They're actually far overrepresented, just showing what big advocacy campaigns these can be, how long they can go on for, how many people can be involved. So in our oral history collection at the Archive Project, at minimum, 10% of our oral histories talk about the hardship application process. I suspect it's actually closer to 20% of our oral histories. And this just shows that this has been really dominating conversations about preservation, despite the fact that hardship applications certainly do not represent even a fraction of 10% of the amount of landmarks in New York City.
Absolutely. And the fact that Laurie mentioned she didn't even see one of them during her tenure, to her recollection. I mean, Laurie, that kind of says it all, right?
It does say it all. And we also were at a time when I was the chairing of the commission that the city was in terrible shape and was not doing the amount of real estate development that happened, I think, under other chairs and other mayors. And if anything, I would have thought that we would have had at least one, and we didn't have one.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. So that's sort of the foundation, right? Pardon the pun. We are talking about buildings here tonight, but that's the foundation of our subject matter. Now, Michael, kind of lawyer to lawyer, right? Let's talk a little bit about those intellectual underpinnings. We mentioned the subject of Tony Wood's book earlier tonight, right? Albert Sprague-Bard. He was an attorney who fought really for decades, trying to get the jurisdictional hook, let's just say, for places like New York City to have landmarks laws to protect their aesthetics, to regulate their aesthetics. But you have to get around this pesky thing called the Constitution, right? The Fifth Amendment's takings clause talking about how private property cannot be taken for public use without just compensation. You have to avoid this taking. So when the landmarks law was being framed back in the 1960s and really earlier when people were still debating whether we need to have a landmarks law, what was it about this safety valve that was so essential? Why did we need to have this takings thing protected? And what is that takings clause after all?
So under the Constitution, under the Fifth Amendment in particular, everyone says when you hear "I'm taking the Fifth," it means I don't have to speak, and that's true. If you ever get pulled over by a police officer, it's a good idea to take the Fifth. But taking the Fifth in the real estate context actually has a completely different meaning. You cannot take property. The federal government cannot take property without just compensation and without it being for a public benefit. And the Fifth Amendment is made applicable to the states through the 14th Amendment, which means that New York State and also the city, New York City, can take your property without just compensation. So how does that relate to reasonable return on investment? Well, the Supreme Court has ruled that sometimes you can so heavily regulate a property that it is deprived of any opportunity to derive economic value from it. And when that happens, that's considered a taken, even if the government doesn't physically take it from you. Because if you can't draw any income from it, then as a practical matter, you don't own it. That's the concept. In this instance, the economic analysis associated with return on investment and the hardship clause is designed to make sure that even landmark properties have the capacity to generate some reasonable return on investment. The landmarks law so basically selects 6% as a reasonable return on investment. And that has carried us since 1965. And it was sustained, the landmarks law was sustained in 1978 in a case called Penn Central. So that provision actually has stood the test of time. The key is, and I'll leave you with this, the key is that it should be applied consistent with the text of the statute as it is written and the purposes for which it was created. It should not be added to, it should not be transmogrified, and I would say in the most diplomatic way I can, merely because developers and preservationists disagree, the Landmark Preservation Commission's job is not to sort of mediate and resolve the dispute in a way that's helpful to both sides or try to find middle ground. The commission is required to apply the law as written, and when it does so, hardships will be very rarely granted because the test is just so hard to meet.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. And, I think all of us on this panel and certainly some of our attendees, especially Mr. Silberman, know of the great Christabel Goff. And she used to always urge us, including in her NIPAP oral history, she would urge us not to call them developers. She would say, call them investors, because that really belies their true motivations, right? But these investors do go up to Albany or down to Washington through the court system all the time on these sorts of issues, right? And these high courts, they are very protective of the Constitution, right? It is not just a little piece of paper to be crumpled up and thrown into the waste bin, right? I mean, as recently as the last couple of days, the Court of Appeals did rule in a different case, I believe in the rental assistance context, saying, if you're having landlords being up for surprise inspections as a condition of rental assistance, that's a warrantless search and seizure, right? I mean, courts take this stuff extremely seriously. Now, Michael mentioned Penn Central versus City, New York. That's code for Grand Central Terminal, right? The Penn Central Railroad was a bastard amalgam of the New York Central Railroad and the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was the standard railroad of the world. After that merger, they found themselves owning Grand Central Terminal, right? And we've already lost Penn Station at this point, which was owned by the Pennsylvania, and the guns were trained at Grand Central Terminal. But the Supreme Court of the United States says, no, hold on. Grand Central Terminal is a landmark, and this landmarks law is constitutional because the investment-backed expectations, right, the reasonable return on investment, not in a hardship context, but just in an overall constitutionality of the landmarks law context, that was an okay thing, right? The landmarks law works because you can still, in this case, through air rights deals, right, Laurie, you can still have a Grand Central Terminal. And Laurie, I know that you spoke at our anniversary of Penn Central versus City of New York.
Right.
And just tell us a little bit about Grand Central Terminal and Penn Central and what it was like as a commissioner and a chair thinking about these things in the back of your head.
Well, again, I had the really good fortune to start working on Grand Central when I was a lot younger and worked for Kent Barwick at the Municipal Art Society. So it really started then. And so it was always in everybody's mind that something eventually could happen with Grand Central. So that when I eventually was the chair, again, this had all been settled by then. So we felt very, very empowered because the Supreme Court recognized not only saving Grand Central, but in saving and recognizing the value and importance of New York City's landmarks law and landmarks laws across the country. And so overall, we felt very empowered. I would say that many of the people that are involved now have no clue and no history and no connection of what we went through for all those years and decades. Now, having Mrs. Onassis involved in that kind of cultural icon, a national treasure, leading the charge with people like Brendan Gill and Senator Moynihan and others, that we were in a great place. I think now landmarks and other issues don't have the same type of value and priority that others have right now. All we keep talking about now, and it's very, very important, affordable housing. At the same time, this landmark issue can't be taken for granted. And I think that the commission under this mayor should find leadership that's going to take this on and say, this is a priority, this is value. And really, the commissioners, I think, need to be better educated as to what's happening with that church and other buildings that could be threatened.
Right. That
So to
church,
me,
of course,
it's about communication, and it's about having a vision and understanding the theatrics of moving this forward and understanding legally. So that's why you have Michael and others, but also a group of us, Tony, HDC, and others, of understanding how you need to be in the streets protesting and how important this is about community.
Absolutely. And that church, of course, being the West Park Presbyterian Church, really the catalyst for our conversation here
Right.
tonight.
Mhm.
I do want to hear from Emily a little bit, though, because I know as an educator, she sees people all the time who are passionate about preservation. But before I do that, I just want to remind everybody that the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen should be
Oh,
active. If you have a
oh,
question that you'd like to ask this evening, please do put it in the chat, and we would love to answer it if we are able. But Emily, you are working with a lot of young people in your teaching, and you've certainly spent a lot of time in the archival record about the importance of preservation and how battles like Grand Central really do loom large in the archival record. Anything you want to add on that point?
Yeah, so I think battles of the hardship application loom large not only in the archival record, but also in the contemporary record that we see in the news. And news that is reaching people who are not just trained preservationists, like many people on this call, or people who are enthusiastic about preservation on an avocational level. So I teach college students who do not have any preservation background at all. I teach Intro to Preservation as one of my courses. And without prompting, my students asked me, and I quote, "What about that church on the Upper West Side?" referring to West Park Presbyterian Church and the ongoing hardship conversation around this space. And I think this just shows how prolific these conversations reach in our society, even for people who would not consider themselves consumers of preservation related content. And honestly, these contemporary cases make creating preservation advocates from people who do not know much about preservation to start much more engaging. They can follow these cases and they can see, hopefully, a success story through these conversations, or equally learn from cases that were not successful in a traditional preservation sense. And I think it's really valuable there in showing that the record we're creating of preservation with these contemporary cases is actually helping shape the next generation of preservation leaders. So I'm hoping that some of my students will say, West Park encouraged me to get involved in preservation. And they'll also, be able to cite specific articles and what will become the archival record in the future.
That's fantastic, Emily. Thank you for sharing that perspective. We so often hear where are all those young people in preservation? Oh, they're out there. All you have to do is look, right? And they're passionate about these types of issues. So we have this landmarks law, right? It obviously comes about after the advocacy of Albert Bard, as we were discussing earlier, giving us that statewide legislation that allows municipalities to create their landmarks laws. We get the law in New York City, right? And it's accounting for this takings issue that Michael and I discussed a few moments ago, right? So it's a means of protecting buildings, but there's also this hardship safety valve, steam release valve, if you will, right? And you see it tested from a takings perspective at the Supreme Court of the United States. We talked a little bit about Penn Central versus City of New York. That's sort of the code aspect of this. But Michael, there's a little bit of another oddity as well. I don't know how tested it's been or how active it's ever been, but there's this hardship appeals panel. What do we know about this thing, Michael?
You're asking me about that. I actually had a nice conversation with Tony about it. That has not come up very often, but I believe Tony actually would be the better expert on this. Tony, do you want to kick this one?
Yeah, I mean, so there was a number of years ago, as a result of an, I think, kind of an unsuccessful hardship application, there was an effort saying that there needed to be an opportunity to appeal a hardship decision without having to go to the courts, right? And so actually, I believe it was a charter. I think it was in the charter that this was put in to create it, and it was fought by the preservation community because, in a sense, we felt that the determination should be by the Landmarks Commission, which has the expertise to make these decisions. But so it was passed to create a hardship appeals panel. So it exists. Maybe it's back to Brigadoon. It's lurking somewhere. It's never been constituted. It'll be interesting because if the commission does not find hardship and the church decides to appeal that decision to the courts, they would have to go through the hardship tribunal first, because otherwise they would not have exercised all their legal opportunities before going into the courts. So we'll see if there's a second chapter to this. if indeed the commission turns them down. And if it does, it'll be interesting because it'll be new territory for everyone. Because something that only exists as a concept on a piece of paper will have to come to life.
Fascinating, Tony, and that type of institutional memory, right? Why this thing came about and how that's what the Archive Project is all about, right? Making sure that these sorts of stories aren't lost when people slip away. So yes, it is in the charter. I think for those of you playing along at home, I believe it's section 3021, as opposed to the hardship application process, which, Michael, interestingly, I don't know if the word hardship actually appears in the landmarks law, but it is, I believe, section 309. Is that a court created thing, Michael? Is that terminology actually from the courts?
I don't know if it's from the courts or whether it just became the handle for that particular provision when it was first invoked. But there's no question that the concept is there. It's an economic hardship that renders the property simply not usable by the owner.
Fascinating, fascinating. Yeah. And, so we're talking a lot about this hardship application and Laurie, maybe turning to you, as you mentioned, you never had one of these before you when you're on the commission, but you've been in and about this preservation world your whole career. And I think it would be really helpful, given your perspective, to tell us a little bit about whether it's a hardship application or anything else. What are some of the effective strategies for advocating at the commission, given your prior experience?
Well, I think that it's not only advocating at the commission, I think it's advocating in the court of the public court, so to speak. And years ago, you had newspapers where you would have someone like Ada Louise Huxtable and other people helping write opinion pieces and getting them published. And you don't have that right now. And I also don't think, there is still some leadership in the city related to preservation, but it doesn't have the same power and appeal that it had years ago when I was really involved. So I feel terribly spoiled that I had the luxury of working with some of the most outstanding people that really, really were interested in advocating, being in the streets. When we were first involved with Grand Central, we closed off the viaduct and had a major concert with famous people talking and then performing. So when was the last time that happened around landmarks? Even Penn Station, when we tried to do things, we only had a couple of local organizations that agreed to file amicus briefs. Landmarks Conservancy, Historic Districts Council was involved, as well as City Club. Municipal Art Society didn't do anything. And maybe somebody from Municipal Art Society is on this panel and they can defend themselves. But years ago, you had opportunity. We all took it for granted that you would be on the streets. You were called street fighters with really people from all different walks of life who are on the boards of these organizations and making a difference and not caring that they're going to be invited to the party or that the mayor was going to like them or not. And unfortunately, I think that some of these people are very good people, but they've lost their way and you have a lot of people that really, there's such malaise right now about everything. So I'd love to see people coming back to really fight in the streets for what they care about related to the fabric of the city.
And Adrian, may I just jump in for just 1 second on this question?
Of course, yeah.
There is a myth that has been perpetuated by people who are seeking to take advantage of the properties in the city of New York. And the myth is that landmark preservation is hostile to affordable housing. Let me be very clear so that everyone on this call knows the truth. Landmark preservation is not hostile to affordable housing. Where does that come from? Well, if you look at politics today, you hear a lot of people talking about how illegal immigrants are voting and destroying our elections. But that's not true either. It's a myth designed to get something done. And the same is true with respect to affordable housing and landmark preservation. Landmark preservation is hostile to the avarice of developers and investors who want to maximize the profit out of every piece of property they can get their hands on. That's what landmark preservation stands in the way of. And so since you can't say that doesn't look good on a bumper sticker, right? Kills landmark preservation because I can't make enough millions of dollars. So what do you say instead? You try to put the forces of affordable housing against landmark preservation and say, that's your enemy. It's landmark preservation. But the fact is, You can have affordable housing and landmark preservation. They work hand in hand. There is no reason why that has to be the case, that people think they're at odds. They are not. I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
And,
Now I'll get off
No,
my soapbox.
and jumping in about sort of the root of that myth, in my opinion, one thing I've noticed as an educator, both on the formal level as an adjunct professor and on a more informal level through the educational work of the New York Preservation Archive Project, is there has been a major decline in the teaching of preservation law and preservation economics in historic preservation programs nationwide. And as a result, the emerging preservationists who are coming out of esteemed institutions don't understand the language. So, for example, when I was at Columbia University, we studied policy. We, of course, studied the landmarks law. Never did I hear about the hardship application during my formal preservation education. I heard about it through the news and through the media and later on in my career. I remember walking past West Park Presbyterian Church when I first moved to New York City around 2019 and thinking, wow, this will be a beautiful space when the scaffolding is down. I had no idea the scaffolding had been up for decades at that time. So I think if we want people to be more informed and more ready to fight for these properties, we need to better value preservation law and preservation economics. And one thing I'm proud of that the Archive Project did well before my time is have a oral history series on preservation through a legal lens, and that's where a lot of the hardship application conversations come from within our own archival record.
that's absolutely right, Emily. And another interesting thing about the commission, to Laurie's point, right? There's this legal and technical element, of course, right? We see the commissioners up there. They have a legal standard. They have their counsel who's on this call tonight. There's the technical aspects, but then there's the human element, right? There's the heartstrings element. And does this commission, just think about it, right? Does this commission want to be a commission that is a bunch of technocrats? Or do they want to do what's in their name? Preserve landmarks, be the Landmarks Preservation Commission, right, Laurie?
There are a couple of questions that have just come up. Well, now I just said one, but there's one question that came up like, what happens if the city or if someone does not maintain their property? Which is, to me, another big issue. And to me, this is about leadership of the city. And to me, years ago, I made a lot of mistakes, and I'm not proud of every single thing I've done in my career, especially in preservation. But as I said, I think we did a lot of great things over the years. And if you notice that in the last number of years, to me, the Buildings Department and the Landmarks Preservation Commission should be doing a much better job together figuring out how you save buildings, not how you demolish them. And if I was there, probably, again, I'm not a lawyer, nor am I the police, but I'd be figuring out a way to go after these people and arrest them. Even if you only had them for 24 hours, nobody wants to be in a prison for 24 hours. And these people have criminal neglect. And they walked away with a slap on their hands. Those properties in the village that were demolished, now they went off and did exactly what they wanted to do. And what did the city do? Nothing. It is an outrage as far as I'm concerned. So years ago, we persuaded I talked to different lawyers and said we legally could do this. And we went to the sheriff and said, we want this. We attacked one part of the city and we went to Canal Street and we sent letters from the sheriff's department, which really didn't have much power, but nobody wants to get a letter from a sheriff. Trust me on this one, because you don't know where it's going to wind up. And people were so upset about getting these letters from the sheriff saying that we could take your property, we could do X, Y, Z. And not all of them, but some of them did clean up their violations. And to me, there has to be another way of thinking about this. And it's about drama and becoming public and embarrassing people as well. But it's not about, I understand a buildings department then have, Landmarks Commission is saying, yes, you have a violation. Buildings department is saying the building is no longer safe. We're going to have to demolish it. The owner has to have, it's not a little fine. To me, as I say, I think these people should be imprisoned. Then you can figure out they can be out on appeal or not, but you just don't let them walk.
We've lost more buildings through owner neglect than we have through the hardship provision of the landmarks law.
Exactly.
Designated, protected New York landmark buildings.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And there's been good work documenting it. So it's a real problem. They didn't even need to go to hardship. They just took them down.
Exactly.
Yeah, let's not give anybody other ideas, but to me, we have to figure out a way. It's not going to be the commission on its own or council at the commission to figure out. I think we, as a responsibility. And years ago, the Municipal Art Society had this phenomenal legal committee that's, I don't even know if they're in, I know that it's still there in spirit, but I don't think they work at all. Am I right, Tony?
I cannot, I can neither confirm nor deny that because I honestly don't know. I think we can definitely say if there is a law committee there at the moment, it's not like the law committee that was there when MAS was actually doing preservation work.
Right. So if it's not going to be the Municipal Art Society, and there is money in that committee because we all helped raise that money, somebody, I mean, to me, is figuring out other ways. I mean, Michael, you can't do this alone. And it would be nice to have a committee that really could be helpful and be creative in doing this, in helping the commission and helping, regular citizens to save these properties.
Laurie, we're hiring. If anybody's listening, I'm glad to talk to them. We are.
Yeah, but I'm dangerous
all
because
night
I have
tonight.
no legal background. I just have very strong opinions. And I think I'm right.
And we love you for them, Laurie. Thank you so much for that. And just as a reminder, everybody, this is our panel convened by the New York Preservation Archive Project on the history, the past, the present, and the future of the hardship application in New York City. Again, generously sponsored by the Richard Hampton Jeanette Foundation and co-sponsored by the Historic Districts Council. Our panel is Michael Hiller, preservation attorney, Laurie Beckelman, who is former chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, and Emily Kahn, who leads us as executive director of the New York Preservation Archive Project. And as the Beatles say, we get by with a little help from our friends. Tony gave our intro, but he's also been chiming in here and there, and we're going to be hearing from Frampton at the end of today as well. Now, we do have some questions in the Q&A in the chat, and just a reminder, please make sure that you're putting your questions in there. We want to make sure that this is a dialogue, not just amongst us, but also including you. Patricia asks, quote, I think there should be a law passed that if a person does not take care of their property, they will be fined. If they are fined 3 times, they will lose the property. Each year, the city should do a mandatory inspection on their properties, and if they continually neglect their property, the city should seize it. It's interesting you mentioned that, Patricia, right? Some people have also suggested, Tony Wood among them, that there should be a demolition tax, right, to incentivize keeping and preserving properties. Michael, thinking about the economics of all of this, what are some of the proposals you've heard that might work outside of the landmarks law to incentivize people doing the right thing by their properties?
Well, the landmarks law, while not perfect, does address this issue. There actually is a requirement that property owners of landmarks actually maintain their properties to the extent that they are consistent with the landmarks law. And when the owner does not maintain the property as required, the commission can actually issue a violation, and if the violations are not paid and the work isn't done, the commission actually has the power to commence legal action and actually create a lien on the property, which could ultimately result in its forfeiture. I would say that one of the things that the commission should consider doing going forward is actually applying that principle with more regularity, because the comment that was made earlier that we've lost more properties to demolition and neglect than we have to hardship applications is 100% true. And the only way we're going to be able to preserve our history is if the commission is as vigilant as it can be. Now, in fairness to the commission, they are, unfortunately, they are constantly trying to preserve their staff because budget cuts are what they are, and there's no question that they are, overworked and under-resourced. I don't envy the work they have to do, and all the commissioners are volunteers, except for the chair. They're not getting paid for their work. So I don't want to pick on the commission too much for not doing this, but what I would say is that they should allocate more of their resources to ensuring that these buildings stay in good condition, because otherwise there won't be anything left to preserve. There won't be any applications to consider if the buildings are all falling apart.
Right, absolutely. And Emily, you're our executive director at NIPAP. How would you make it work if you had a staff, but none of them were paid, right? And they all had other jobs, they had to do other things. Is that really a practical thing if you're trying to have a full-time operation as a leader of a group?
Objectively, no.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And in speaking with your students, and I'm sure people in your peer group as well, there are some who go in and out of the commission. And just tell us a little bit about the type of talent, especially young talent, that ends up at the commission, and anything you may know about that world, because that's a typical question that we get. I haven't seen it in the Q&A yet, but there's always a desire to understand what draws people to go work there.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't worked specifically at the Landmarks Preservation Commission. I don't know what draws people to work there per se. I do know what draws people to testify, which oftentimes is personal connection to a space from a neighborhood level. Maybe they've used that space for their own purposes or their own works purposes. Maybe it connects to a favorite architectural style or a favorite architect, or it represents an underrepresented community that they hope to advocate for. So, I think a lot of people coming into the preservation field as early career professionals are going where the jobs are, frankly. And we're fortunate to be in a city where the Landmarks Preservation Commission does offer a substantial number of preservation jobs with good benefits. I think what's important to note is that I don't have a legal background. Laurie, you've said you don't have a legal background. And you don't need to have a legal background to be a great advocate when it comes to hardship applications or just landmarks in general. And I see that with both my peers and with the great luminaries of preservation. So, Adrian, you mentioned Christabel Goff, the great citizen advocate of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. We've been very fortunate to acquire 142 boxes of her papers through our Saving Papers initiative, and the hardship application is all over those. Additionally, we recently acquired 6 to 8 boxes of papers on the hardship application and the advocacy for the First Avenue estates on the Upper East Side. And the woman who donated those, Elizabeth McCracken, she doesn't come from a preservation background. She doesn't come from a legal background, but she was a resident and she's passionate about her longtime home. So I think what draws people to testify again is that personal connection. And oftentimes that personal connection is why people are choosing to take a preservation class in the first place, or maybe even choose to become a professional preservationist. That's certainly the case in my experience.
Absolutely. And it's so great that you mentioned First Avenue Estates, because not only was that a hardship application battle, and we can get into that in a little bit, but also to Michael's point, right? This point that preservation and landmarks, they are affordable housing, right? In the case of that. And these are the places, Lori, that make New York, New York. As Tony often says, what would New York be without the Brooklyn Bridge and Grand Central Terminal, right, Lori?
Yeah, but I want to go back to something. I don't want to dismiss the individuals, especially Emily, that you refer to. When you think about the Historic District Council and Frampton can know more about all the individuals that are really involved in what an impact HDC makes, or the New York Landmarks Conservancy, or the Friends of the Upper East Side, or West Pride. I mean, we can, there's so many other organizations locally that are just New Yorkers that really care about their communities. And so it's not that we don't have it, but what I was trying to say is that it was front and center, but it was also at a time when you had newspapers that were actually covering it, that you had journalists that were writing opinions. When was the last time that the New York Times took something like this on? When was the last time that you had someone that was assigned as an urban writer? When was the last time that the New Yorker had a piece like this? How many decades ago is that? I mean, that's what my frustration is. But you do have an incredible, and also to me, some of the most unsung heroes are the people that are working at the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Think about it. You have what, 157, probably more historic districts. All those buildings have to go before the commission. So the staff, as Michael says, they are overworked, underpaid, and we're always afraid that they're going to lose their staff.
Yeah.
And as you designate more, there's more pressure on the commission.
Adrian, if I was going to just jump in. Adrian, you asked me earlier what sort of suggestions that can be made. And since I think Mark Silberman is on this call, I really want to answer that question very directly. I know Mark can't control this, but at the BSA, legislation was passed to require all applicants to testify under oath. It is not a requirement of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, which generally means that applicants can lie with impunity. I can tell you right now, I have seen it. And, you know, I would say for the commissioners who are working as volunteers, they are, on hardship applications, they are inundated with mountains of data and complicated issues. Those 4 requirements, at least 2 of them are quite complicated. They shouldn't have to add to that burden, having to decipher who's telling the truth and who isn't. They should be assured that the information they're getting is honest. And since the commission is considered to be an adjudicative body, let's swear them in. Let's swear the applicants in. And then I guarantee you the testimony is going to be different. And instead of it being a $25,000 fine, which is the way it is at the BSA, you know, what developer wouldn't say, I'm going to get a $50 million profit, I'll pay a $25,000 fine by lying. No. If someone lies, the application's denied for 2 years. I guarantee you people will be a lot more careful to tell the truth if their application's on the line. So, Mark, if you're listening, lobby the city council to try to get that outcome. I would love Chris Marte. I wish you were on this. Chris Marte is the chair of the Landmarks Committee and City Council. That's a great piece of legislation. I'd love to see him pass.
Michael, I know Tony wanted to chime in, but just sticking with you for one more moment, right? We do see many attorneys who advocate at the commission, I guess present company included, right? But attorneys have an independent ethical obligation to not lie and to be candid in their dealings with tribunals, whether it's a court or in their everyday personal dealings, right? That's something that we've seen again and again, people losing their law license for. Why do you think some of these silver-tongued silversmiths tend to play fast and loose at the commission in particular?
Well, I would not say, I'm not really pointing my finger at lawyers. I'm pointing my finger at applicants and their design advocates. I wouldn't even call them like engineers and architects. They are design advocates. They are there to advocate for a particular outcome. And when they're doing that, they're marshaling what they are considering facts, but very often they're not facts. As far as lawyers are concerned, lawyers can only be as good as the facts they're given. I guess that's kind of a lawyer's defensive way of saying we never lie. But let me just say this. I think at the BSA, lawyers are actually required to tell the truth also. I think they are required to be sworn. It's not a big step. And quite frankly, think about it for a minute. What's the argument against that? Wait a minute. No, I have to be able to lie. Is that the counter argument? Of course not. Let them tell the truth. Make it easier on the commissioners so they can focus on the actual facts and not having to figure out who's not telling the truth.
Now, Tony, I think you wanted to chime in a few moments ago.
Yeah, I know I'm not officially part of the panel, but I just a little history background. I think it was Kent Barwick. I wanted to kind of riff on Emily's point about kind of the involvement of average kind of normal folks in preservation. Kent would always say, and I'm going to assume he knew because he's former chair, that there are only 2 laws that exist because the people of New York actually demanded them. And when you look at the history of how we got the landmarks law, it was the people of New York who demanded. It wasn't top-down mayor. It wasn't top-down elected officials. They finally had to do it. The other law, according to Kent, is the Pooper Scooper law. But that I can't talk about. But I think the origin of the law was from the citizens of New York wanting this. And I think that's something that's also been forgotten by the younger generation out there today of kind of people living in New York who've never lived through the loss of major buildings and think this is some, law being forced down on the city and by, experts, wild planners, et cetera. Totally not the case. This came up from the people of New York. And I guess if we lose some more landmarks, hopefully we won't, the people of New York hopefully will rise up again and say, we don't want to lose the block south of Penn Station. We don't want to lose any more churches. We don't want to lose more buildings in Greenwich Village to demolition by neglect.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, let's talk specifics a little bit, right? We mentioned St. Bart's a little bit earlier. I know that Laurie's eager to talk a little bit about St. Bart's, especially given her time at the Conservancy, dealing with that battle. And it's one of those things that keeps coming up when you talk about the hardship law, right? So I believe the story goes that there was an offer of $100 million to monetize the community house property behind St. Bart's, and that sort of bubbled into a mammoth hardship battle. I believe it went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. And of course, we still have St. Bart's to this day. And I was just there a couple of months ago. And it's funny to hear how the congregants and the staff, they know that something very significant landmark wise happened there. They don't quite know what it was. But Laurie, help us out. Tell us a little bit about the Battle of St. Bart's, as the book is titled.
Well, I think that there was a Reverend Bowers who had this mythical idea that he was going to, really rule all the airwaves with new radio and television. And he was going to, I guess, sell his soul for the church to be this, mystical person. And so he obviously lost dramatically. So people were up in arms, outraged in the streets, protesting against it, and it went through the courts into the Supreme Court. What's interesting, and which we can go on and on about it, but the good news is the battle was won, and at the same time, the church still needs a lot of money. And right before I was getting on this panel, I was on a Zoom with people that are running the foundation, talking about strategizing about other ways of getting substantial sums of money to continue to restore the community house. And money has been raised. They still need a lot of money, but they're in much better shape than you would imagine at this point. So it took a very, very long time with a lot of people who are not necessarily even members of the church, but really know how valuable this specific Episcopal church is within the realm of religious institutions in the city of New York and in the country.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. And just turning to the Q&A, and as a reminder, if you do have any questions, please continue to put them in there. I do just want to voice a comment on something we spoke about a little bit earlier. Anonymous says, too many properties were lost because they were neglected, to that point of demolition by neglect, right? This should not be allowed. By law. A person has to take care of their property, or maybe the city should take it by eminent domain. That's a law that could be passed, saying that we can save properties that, may be in bad condition. You could potentially step in. Now, St. Bart's is in pretty good condition. I encourage folks to go over there. But when it comes to smaller religious congregations, maybe Michael, and then if other panelists want to chime in, perhaps Emily, Lorna, a former leader of the Historic Districts Council, we mentioned them quite a bit. We'll be hearing from Frampton, their leader, a little bit later. Tony was involved in the formation of that group. I was deputy director of that group at one point, right? Lorna asks, with so many small religious congregations that own landmarks facing diminished memberships and resources, as is purportedly the case at West Park, what remedies do you suggest to help those small congregations avoid filing hardship applications? Michael, do you want to take that, and then maybe others jump in?
So this has actually been going on. This is a dynamic that's been going on for decades. There is simply a decline in organized spirituality. People aren't going to synagogue and church, and if people who are being spiritual, they're mostly doing it at home, or maybe they go once or twice a year. And as a consequence of that, these congregations are suffering. But there is a solution to it. The solution, of course, is to adaptively reuse the properties. That can be done in one of two ways. You can, the interior of religious properties cannot be regulated by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. So religious communities can do what they want to do with the interiors of their properties, and that could include, for example, putting a stage on, in your, or putting not a cafeteria, what's a catering hall. You can, and if you think about it, I grew up Jewish. I know that every temple that I ever went to was actually a closeted catering hall that also had religious services in it. That was just the way it went. And there's no reason why you can't adaptively reuse it for purposes of like community facility stuff. You could also do what they did with the First Church of Christ Scientist on 96th and Central Park West. That was converted to a children's museum, and it's been very successful. So the alternative is that the owner can sell the property, but to use it adaptively while still maintaining the exterior. That's an okay solution too. What is not okay is for congregations not to maintain their properties, to allow them to fall into disrepair, and then to say, "Oh my gosh, that the property is in good repair. I don't know what to do. I think I should knock it down and sell it for $33.4 million to the highest bidder." That's not acceptable.
Right, right. And Patricia Murphy in the comments is saying something similar, community centers, theaters, catering halls, other types of community affairs, or even sell it to someone who could afford it, right, and not knock it down. But maybe Lori and Emily, whoever wants to jump in on this, of course, at West Park, we did see that example of a community theater, right? And it seemed to be working pretty well. But even in spite of that, these investors came out of the woodwork with a little bit of a plan to try and knock that church down. So what is happening when you have a group who's trying to do the right thing and have community theater and community arts and potentially even turning a profit, but people kind of swoop in from the outside? What do we think about that?
I wouldn't say that that's exactly the way it happened at West Park. What's happened at West Park in the year 2024, the center at West Park was wildly successful. They got grant money. They made a $1.2 million profit. And one of the things I was heartened to listen to and I don't want to get too deeply into the specifics of any particular application, but at the March 10th hearing, I heard the commissioners asking the question: if the center at West Park was able to generate a $1.2 million profit and get grant money and offer to repair the building, why can't you? Why is it that the building can't be maintained? And I think the answer is it can be. That's the whole point. It's been proven. And anytime you have a property that is capable of generating a return, capable of being functional and helpful to its community, it should be preserved. West Park is a wildly successful property, or at least it was, until the owner of the property evicted everybody.
So this is an overly simplistic answer, but my background prior to the archive project was actually in sacred sites. I worked for the National Trust for Historic Preservation on the National Fund for Sacred Places. And I will say, in the most simplistic level, what we need to save these congregations, even in cases where the congregation remains in a largely reused building, is more funding. So I think one of the most powerful tools in New York City right now is the New York Landmarks Conservancy's Sacred Sites program. I've seen such great good come out of that. One thing my students are shocked to hear when we talk about the landmarks law is that becoming a New York City landmark does not guarantee you any money. There's no type of endowment that comes with landmarking a building, either in terms of immediate cash or in terms of maintaining buildings in perpetuity. So we need to think of more creative funding opportunities for these sacred sites. I also think this is less to do about how to save sacred sites that are threatened today. But one of my favorite hardship application examples, and actually one of the stories that got me into preservation history, is St. Paul and St. Andrews on the Upper West Side. It's about 10 blocks from where I live. I have participated in numerous great events there. When I was at the National Trust, my parting recommendation was to give funding through the National Fund for Sacred Places to St. Paul and St. Andrews, which happened. And this congregation's current investment in preservation, as a fundamental core of their mission, is so diametrically opposed to where they were at the time of the hardship application. They were anti-landmarking. They fought to try to make insensitive alterations and demolitions to this landmark. And nowadays, they look back at this history and talk about how they've grown to appreciate their historic building as such an asset. So I think highlighting stories like these can actually help advocate for the saving of sacred sites in the future. So St. Paul and St. Andrew is a great example. In our collection, we have Herb Broderick talking about it in an oral history, so I encourage you to check that out. But yeah, I mean, it comes down to funding, but I don't have a great solution there, especially because of constitutional restrictions when it comes to government funding of sacred sites and religious properties.
We should say,
Right.
though, we are so much better positioned today to help historic religious properties than when the crisis is of St. Bart's and of that moment. So we have Partners for Sacred Places, the wonderful national group, which is a huge resource. They also have a grant program that I think Emily is very well aware of. So there's a lot that's been learned. The Conservancies Grant Program, all of those and partners grew out of preservation's response to realizing that those buildings were important and they needed help, and that we needed to stand up and help those buildings if we wanted to preserve them. And so the good news is there's a huge awareness in the preservation community and a willingness to help try and save those buildings.
I mean, there is, but unfortunately, as with most of these types of programming, whether it be not-for-profits wanting money for them or the arts or other things that are part of the civic culture, there is very little money and there are fewer foundations that are giving to that. But do you remember many years ago, Tony, when we created a bond act for both preservation and the environment together through the state? And so that religious properties were able to use the money for the exteriors.
And let me just mention one other point about just so we don't overstate the case. Let's remember that many of these religious organizations are part of umbrella organizations which have hundreds of millions of dollars at their disposal. The Presbytery USA has hundreds of millions of dollars at its disposal. I think the last financial report I saw was almost $750 million. They've got money. If they really want to restore these buildings, they can.
Right, it's a great point. And, again, the chat is alive with some of these suggestions, people talking about maybe keeping the old building intact and incorporating something new. Although we've seen applications like that at NYU in particular, down in the East Village, where preservationists really up in arms about what that ended up looking like. So that can be a double-edged sword sometimes. There's also a question about whether there's been a formal survey of religious properties that have been adaptively reused in the city. That question coming from Andrew Cronson. I know there's been some work done around that. Anybody know any particulars that they might want to share?
But it's a great idea, so that perhaps the Landmarks Conservancy or maybe HDC would like to consider it. It's a wonderful idea. And I don't know why we didn't think about it a long time ago.
I mean, I teach a class on adaptive reuse. I love that idea as an ongoing project. I do want to point out that Landmark West has done a feature of historic buildings in the Upper West Side, not that have inherently been reused or repurposed, but they have spent a lot of time looking into the history and the presence of these buildings within my neighborhood.
The HDC has been keeping a list because mostly in response to the proposal to build a new tower on the Hanson Methodist Church in Brooklyn. So we've been looking at how houses of worship have been adapted both in good ways and bad ways around the city.
Thank you for that, Frampton. And now we've officially had both of our non-panelists chiming in on the panel. This is a good thing. We like it. The more voices, the better. So we are drawing a little bit towards a close where we'll toss things to Frampton for his concluding remarks. Just a couple of other points we want to hit, right? Number one, we would be remiss if we didn't ask this question, right? This is something that Michael, Laurie, Emily, myself, Tony, and Frampton, we all focus on all the time. What are the biggest challenges to the Landmarks Commission today? Michael, kick us off.
I've already mentioned one, which is that the commissioners confronted with applicants and their design representatives that are simply not required to be truthful. I think that's the very biggest challenge right now facing the commission. The other is that I would emphasize is the struggle to ensure that the focus of the commission is on preservation of the properties and not being institutionally protective. And I understand there's got to be a focus to some degree on making sure we always have a landmarks law, like making sure we always have a landmarks preservation commission. We need those institutions in order to preserve property. So I'm not insensitive to that. But at the same time, a balance has got to be struck to make sure that what we don't do is that we're so careful that we want to protect the commission and the landmarks law that we stop protecting properties. And in the end, in my view, the commission has to first and foremost, in order to preserve itself and the landmarks law, is to protect properties. And if we are protecting properties, the landmarks law and the commission will endure. So between getting truthful testimony and focusing mostly on preservation of the properties, I think that's the best path moving forward to overcome the challenges of the commission.
I think one of the biggest issues that we have in the city now, with very exciting to have a new young mayor who is charismatic and wants to create affordable housing, And Michael, you brought this up when we've discussed this before, but let's not forget the city of yes. The city of yes has been, I think, not being very honest about landmarks and what the role that Landmarks Preservation Commission and what we all play in enhancing our city and why people are here. And if you look at, and Vishaan Chakrabarty, who is not a preservationist, who is a great architect and an advocate for the city and good planning and good design, he's done studies and articles about how many sites, or I think you could build almost 500,000 properties outside of the historic districts, outside of landmark areas. And I think that is one of the biggest concerns we have now.
Thank you. And Emily, I saw you wanting to jump in too.
Yeah, so I think Michael and Laurie have covered this very well from a legal and an advocacy perspective. I'm going to, really reinforce the historian hat wearing right now and say it comes down to documentation. So the Landmarks Preservation Commission is not always known for having the best archival record keeping. There was a crisis around the time I started as executive director when the LPC was moving offices and there was questions about what is happening to all these archival papers. And I think what's important moving forward is that the LPC needs to have better record keeping policies so that we can look back at precedents years from now. And I think it's also important that we, as preservation advocates, save preservation papers related to the hardship application and beyond. So even though some of the records of early LPC hearings may not exist within their own archival records anymore, we have an abundance of materials from Christabel Goff to give the true facts of what was said at these hearings. So I really think it comes down to documentation and record keeping from the grassroots to the governmental level.
That's such a good point, Emily, and that's exactly why we're doing this program here tonight to underscore what shadows of the past can teach us about present battles. And if you are interested in supporting that important work, the New York Preservation Archive Project, NIPAP, is the group putting on this panel tonight. You can find us at www.nipap.org, and you can also make a donation there if you believe in what you've been hearing tonight. And certainly, please visit the websites and contribute to Historic Districts Council and the Jen Rett Foundation as well. So as we move more towards a close and Frampton's closing remarks, I'd like to turn to each of you, perhaps starting with Laurie and then going to Emily and then closing with Michael. We talked about the very earliest days. We talked about the intellectual underpinnings of the hardship application. We talked about the statute, the hardship appeals panel. We talked about some case studies, and we talked about the West Park battle. But let's talk a little bit about the future. What is the future of the hardship application in New York, or what do you think the future should be?
I would like to hand this over to Michael and not get involved with it at all because I really am not familiar enough with it. And as each one of us talked about, and as a reminder, a couple of people said, think about it. It's over 60 years and how few hardship applications we've had. That's all I'm going to say.
Sounding like the future should be fewer.
Yes.
Well, it looks like the baton was passed to you, Michael. You want to jump in quickly with yours?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have the answer I don't have a silver bullet answer. I would say to you very simply, we don't know what the future of preservation is going to be with respect to hardship applications until this one is decided. Because if this application were to be granted, it is a roadmap for developers to demolish buildings simply by allowing them to fall into disrepair. I know that the applicant took umbrage at the suggestion that that's what happened, but it is what happened. And the fact of the matter is that, and I'm not going to get into an argument over the West Park Presbyterian application. I would simply say to you, I don't think it meets any of the 4 requirements. I think that the argument that it ceases to be suitable, adequate, and appropriate is absurd because it was used, including by the owner, even after they filed the hardship application, even after they evicted all the tenants, they were still using it for religious services, for a lighthouse chapel, and they were using it for art exhibitions. If the building's so dangerous that it can't be used, it has to be fixed right away, how come they're still using it? I could go on and on, but I won't. I'll simply say that I genuinely hope this application is denied, because if the application is denied, it'll be a message to the rest of the development community that you can't walk all over the landmarks law, that landmarks have to be respected, and that there are people out there who are willing to fight to preserve them.
Michael, thank you so much. And Emily, anything else you'd like to add on the future of this oft-mysterious legal tool?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're all hoping for a successful preservation outcome for West Park Presbyterian Church, but I want to emphasize that even in the cases of great preservation losses, there's a lot of learning that can be gained. So, in studying the history of the hardship application, we need to talk about not just the cases that have been successful, but also the cases that have been unsuccessful for buildings that we have lost. And I think in preservation, we all know that we can't save every building. We know it too well, frankly. Yet there's a bit of a taboo around talking about our losses. And we at the Archive Project have found that from a preservation history standpoint, we can learn just as much or possibly even more from talking about the sites that, no longer physically stand with us. So I think we just need to talk about the hardship application. There's no excuse for preservation students to have never heard about the hardship application when they're studying policy in New York City. So yeah, just talking about the hardship application and just talking about both the successes and failures of the preservation movement.
Emily, thank you. Michael, thank you. Laurie, thank you. What an invigorating and stimulating panel that really took us through the past, present, and the future of the hardship application. And Laurie mentioned the great late Ada Louise Huxtable on our Wrecking Ball podcast. As Tony knows, he's been a guest twice. We end every episode with a segment called Your Daily Ada Louise. We share one of her quotes, one of those fiery quotes about how to bring preservation forward in a contemporary city. But today it's Your Daily Frampton Tolbert, because we're so fortunate to have Frampton from the Historic Districts Council, its executive director. He's also a former deputy director, my old job there, so I really feel some kinship with Frampton. He's at the front lines of the West Park battle that we've been discussing in a historical context tonight, and we're so fortunate to have Frampton here to close us out. Frampton.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'll be brief because I think a lot of our attendees are well aware of what's going on at West Park and are very engaged. And to Laurie's point, that's really what we need. We need people to be engaged and continue to be engaged in these multi-year processes. This West Park battle has been going on formally since 2022 and has been talked about from even before then. So this can go on for a long time. I mean, back to Tony's original point about St. Bart's, my recollection on hardship was the St. Vincent's case, where that went on for quite a while. And in the end, the Landmarks Commission approved the demolition of that beautiful modernist O'Toole building on 7th Avenue, but it remains today because the hospital went bankrupt and now it's been restored. So sometimes we can win these things, and we will win as well at West Park. So just a little bit on the way of background. As I think everyone knows, this application is to demolish West Park Presbyterian Church to redevelop the site for a new residential building developed by the company Alchemy. And as I said, this originally came forward in 2022, but the application was withdrawn in 2024 after a very lengthy hearing process before the LPC ever voted on the merits of the application. So that's something, good to remember. They've already tried this once, and they withdrew their application. The application was refiled in 2025. So thus far, Manhattan Community Board 7 has held 2 hearings, a hearing at their land preservation committee and at their full board, and they voted to deny the hardship. And there was an additional LPC hearing on December 9th of last year, where we saw hundreds of people showing up and testifying online, sending letters, really on both sides, but huge amounts of support for the building. And just this week, there was another hearing where the applicant was given the opportunity to rebut the previous public testimony and answer commissioner questions. And to, what you all have been talking about, this is all part of the formal hardship process. This is how the process is supposed to go. So now comes the question, how can you help? And I think that I'm speaking here as HEC. NIPAP is not endorsing this advocacy message, but this application is still not decided. You can still send your testimony. If you were on this call and you have not testified, you can still send your testimony to testimony@lpc.nyc.gov. We still need your voice. We still need the commissioners to see your comments, especially if you haven't testified before. But even if you have, it's really important to talk about the importance of the architecture, the history, and the cultural significance of the building. while we all really appreciate what the Center at West Park has done, we really want the testimony to focus on the building itself and its significance to the neighborhood and the city and beyond. If you have any knowledge or expertise on the building, we want to hear from you. If you've attended services there, if you have professional expertise, we're still looking for people to work with. So email hdc@hdc.org, and we will work with you to make sure that you get involved. And we expect this application to return to LPC very soon, possibly as soon as next month, for further consideration and a possible vote. So this will be coming down to the wire very quickly. So stay tuned, look for messages from HDC and others on how you can still show up for West Park. So with that, back to you, Adrian.
Frampton, thank you so much. Thank you, Tony, Michael, Laurie, and Emily for a fantastic evening. We have recorded this evening's presentation. It will live on. Thanks to each and every one of you at home for joining us. And please remember, it's not a hardship to learn more about hardships, right? There's a tremendous amount on NIPAP's website that you can go and explore on your own time as we ponder the hardship application of today and tomorrow. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening and keep preserving New York. Take care.
Bye.